Welcome to Module 3 of the Implementing ITIL course, Baselining the Effort, ITIL Assessments. In this learning module, we'll focus on conducting the IT Service Management Assessments. One of the unique things about the approach presented in our course is that we not only assess processes, but also technologies, organization, and governance, which includes your decision-making and especially how you report the quality of the services you deliver. This is what makes our approach a little bit unique. Looking holistically at those four pillars, as we call it, process, technology, organization, and governance, is key to doing a very round assessment and moving forward towards your vision. Here's a recap of our implementation approach. Remember, we start with the visioning process, identifying our goals, objectives, and why we're implementing ITIL to begin with. We then move on to an assessment, which analyzes where we at today, what is our current state. We then move to planning in terms of translating the outputs of that assessment into action items and initial wins. And as we execute those initial wins, we will go through a design stage and a transition stage. When we're done with this round of implementation, we'll then go back to our visioning, look at where we are at that point in time, and then go back through the entire cycle again. In Module 1, we were introduced to an overview of this implementation approach. In learning Module number 2, we went through the ITSM visioning in much more detail. In this module, Module 3, we'll cover the ITSM assessment approach. This particular module has 5 lessons that we will cover. In Lesson 1, we will look at the assessment work stage and take a deeper dive into some of the steps and concepts that are involved with assessing your processes, technologies, organization, and governance. Then in Lessons 2, 3, 4, and 5, we'll take an individual look at a deeper dive at the processes, how do you assess your technologies, how do you assess your organization, and how do you assess the governance and reporting practices that you have. Even though you may plan on using an outside consultant for assessment activities, the steps outlined here in this learning module should still be understood in order to get the most value out of those activities. If you plan on using an outside consultant or third-party vendor to do the assessment, this module will help guide you in terms of some of the things that you may want to look for and how you might scope and position that assessment within your own efforts. Module 3, Lesson 1, the Assessment Work Stage, a Deeper Dive. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the IT Service Management Assessment Work Stage in more detail. We'll talk about the work steps that get executed in this stage and some of the high-level concepts that are involved with doing an assessment. This is the general flow of activity that will occur in the IT Service Management Assessment Work Stage. It illustrates the overall flow for identifying which initial win projects will yield the most benefit. And that is really the outcome that we are trying to get to. Maturity levels are nice, and they're certainly an interesting benchmark, but at the end of the day, we want to use the assessment to help identify what are the key action items and strategies that we need to execute, the pieces and parts of ITIL that we need to implement in order to meet our business objectives. And that will come by doing the assessment. First, assessments are conducted to identify the current state of our IT operations and compare this to ITIL recommended good practices. Findings and gaps will result from the assessment. These are examined and analyzed to produce an inventory of action items that will overcome them. Here's one example. You may have a finding that might indicate that there is no communication between IT and the business for understanding what services and service targets need to be delivered. An outcome of the assessment may yield that action items need to be taken to overcome that, and those action items might include developing and agreeing a service portfolio or catalog, and maybe another project to establish and assign IT business liaisons to directly communicate what services are available and work with the business units. So as we go through the assessment, there will be an inventory of these findings and action items, and a workshop will generally be done as part of that to help identify what are the priorities, which one is the most important. How do we group these and decide what initial win projects we really want to take going forward? Once we select the top initial win projects, we do some detailed write-ups for them. These can now be included in a program or project charter document. They include the scope, definition, key activities, and roles needed to execute each initial win, and move forward with our actual implementation effort. In learning module number 3, for right now, we are only going to focus on the very first box, which is conduct IT service management assessments. The learning module number 4, and as we move forward beyond that, we'll address the other steps that are shown in this particular flow. Again, our assessment effort will focus on 4 pillars of our solution: process, technology, organization, and governance. We will do an assessment for each one of those. The goal of the assessment effort is to examine our current operational state, compare it against criteria outlined for ITIL good practices, identify the gaps found, and recommendations to overcome those gaps. Note that a quality assessment looks at all 4 of these pillars, not just process by itself. If you leave out other pillars, in other words, let's say you just do a process assessment but don't look at the technology, organization, and governance, you may lose some credibility in terms of the outcomes and actions that you recommend. You may also end up implementing a very incomplete solution. So you really need to look at all 4 of these. These will always carry over into almost everything we do in the entire ITIL implementation effort. So as we go forward from this point, keep thinking process, technology, organization, and governance. Here's an overview of the key work steps within the IT service management assessment effort. We're obviously going to manage the assessment work stage as it moves forward. We're going to focus our assessment in areas that are applicable to the scope and the vision that we decided in the ITSM visioning stage. We're then going to conduct assessments for processes, technologies, organization, and governance practices. We'll analyze the findings from all those assessments, identify recommended actions, translate those to initial win efforts, and obtain a go-forward agreement to move forward with those efforts. And that will be the essence of our implementation. Here's the key outputs from the assessment work stage: assessment results, stakeholder analysis, action items, and our initial win write-ups. The assessment results will highlight the gaps in the findings that we see between the current state and our planned vision that we decided in the ITSM visioning stage. So we're going to be comparing how well do we stack up against where our target state needs to be. Typically, you may hear the term gap analysis, and that is the essence of what our assessment results will show. We also will have a stakeholder analysis, and remember we covered some concepts around managing stakeholders in Learning Module 2. But here we're going to look at those groups in more detail. We're going to identify the needs for each stakeholder group, the what's in it for me, and prioritize some of those stakeholder needs. Again, some of that will be driven off some of the surveys that we identified in Learning Module number 2, and those are things you can do to analyze the stakeholder needs a little more in detail. Action items will then be developed. We need to combine our gap analysis with what our stakeholders are looking for to help prioritize and identify which actions to look for. And then we will translate those action items and group those into initial win projects. Note that it's very important to combine what our stakeholders are looking for with what the gaps were that we found during our assessments in our process, technologies, organization, and governance. If we don't do that, what we will end up with is a large inventory of findings, and it will be very unclear in terms of where we should go next. This is a very common mistake and an error that a lot of people that do implement tend to make. They compare the idle requirements and what should be in each process to maybe what their current state is. And sometimes I've seen lists of hundreds and hundreds of gaps that exist between what idle is saying you should be doing versus what you may be doing currently. The problem is you cannot implement all that at once. So you need to prioritize those items. And the only way to help with that prioritization and some of that impact analysis is to do the stakeholder analysis to understand what your stakeholders are really looking for, and then prioritize what those action items should be. But again, these are the 4 items that will typically come out of our assessment efforts as we go forward. One consideration is, how do we want to approach the assessment? We typically have 2 key choices. We can do this in-house with our own staff, our own IT people, or we can hire an independent consultant. If we do it in-house, the advantages to that approach are, number 1, it will be very low cost, and number 2, the organization and cultural aspects are already understood. In other words, your IT people already know how you operate, what your values are within your company. If we go with an outside consultant, one of the advantages we get is we get an independent outside analysis of what's really going on. We may get some new thinking to problems and issues. We may also get experience that the consultants can bring in from other companies that may be implementing and working with idle already. And if we hire the right kind of consulting party to do this, they will not have any bias to the results. It is strongly recommended that an independent third party be used to perform the assessment. This ensures that a fair independent view is provided. When you look for an outside third party to do this, they should have IT operational management expertise combined with the idle expertise. Preferably, from a certification aspect, they're idle certified at the practitioner or higher level. And also, they have no bias towards any tooling or sourcing solution. This ensures that you have a third independent party that is very neutral in terms of what they see in your organization and are not biasing the results of the assessment towards any particular tooling solution or whether you should outsource something or not outsource something. The disadvantage of trying to do an assessment on your own or in-house are many. Experience has shown that there's a very strong tendency to do these with biased attitudes and answers. Worse, it propagates a narrow mindset, since the people doing the assessment are probably the same people who already manage and run IT. There really is a lot to be gained by using a good outside party with the right skills and experience, even if the idle implementation effort doesn't move any farther forward. If done right, you will see a lot of interesting results and really helps you identify where you sit today. When looking at that third-party assessor, these are some things you may want to consider as you look for them, and maybe think of these as criteria as you decide which third-party assessor to go with. Number 1, they need broad IT operational experience. Strong idle skills, as we said before. They need to be able to look at the big picture, make sure can they assess not only the idle processes, but also your technologies, organization, and governance and reporting practices. Look at the assessment approach that they use. Are they neutral? They don't have a bias towards anything. What kinds of assessment outputs do they produce? Maybe they can give you examples of things they've done for other customers or clients. And also that they've got idle implementation experience. Now, the reasons for all these is that you don't just want somebody that understands idle without understanding how you really organize and operate IT. Otherwise, the output of what you will get will tend to be very theoretical in nature, and you'll constantly be questioning, can this really be done in my organization? If somebody comes in with a combination of real IT management experience plus the idle background, then they will be able to apply the idle concepts and give you some very solid help and understanding in terms of what works, what doesn't work, or how you might approach something within your organization. Without that, again, they might just be citing theoretical gaps and ideas in terms of what you need to do to move forward. Again, a key principle about the assessments. We want to focus our time and focus our findings and analysis in areas that relate directly to the vision that we created in our step one of our implementation effort, the ITSM visioning step. Don't spend too much time on findings that do not have a direct impact on IT costs. In short, don't just come up with a list of gaps that are, and I use this in quotes, different from what ITIL says, that in terms of what the book says versus what you may actually be doing. I've seen lots of reports with pages and pages of recommendations, and this really is not very helpful to IT because you then start to wonder, well, where should you start? You're just as confused before you even started the assessment. If you hire a third-party consultant and you see this happen, ask why those are listed. What are the impacts of those, and what's the benefit if you do close those gaps? Because the ITIL book says so as being the answer is really not acceptable in terms of helping you move forward. Try to stick to those gaps and those findings that are actually creating IT problems. You and the assessor should always be asking, what is the true impact? By not having this, here is what is going on in your organization. In other words, if you fix this gap, you might help reduce incidents. If you fix this gap, you might create better customer satisfaction. In other words, each one of these findings should tie to a specific goal, especially that one that you did in your visioning step prior to this. And again, as you can see, this is why having a vision and a set of goals and objectives is so critical in terms of helping your effort move forward efficiently and being well focused to provide some value. Again, here's our key assessment outputs: assessment results, recommendations, inventory of prioritized action items, and our recommended initial win projects. The assessment results will identify what gaps exist between our current and future state. They also provide a benchmark between our current state and IT service management good practices. Again, this is where the maturity levels tend to fall. Our recommended actions is an inventory of recommended actions to be taken to overcome those gaps that were identified during the assessment. Our inventory of prioritized action items is then basically our action item list, but now prioritized based on the outcomes of our program visioning work stage that we went through earlier in our learning modules. The recommendations should also include impact statements that describe what might be expected if you don't follow through with the implementation. And then our recommended initial win projects will group those action items into those win projects, and then this will be an inventory of what those projects are. Those will provide noticeable short-term benefits to IT and the business organizations they support. Think of an initial win project as a sub-project within your implementation program. It provides real benefits, and one of the guidelines and rules is it must be completed within a year, preferably 6 to 9 months. The initial win project should indicate which assessment recommendation actions that they are truly addressing. So as you complete this, you will actually map your findings and recommendations to those projects, so it's very clear what the scope of those projects should be and how those projects were derived. Here's our assessment stage workflow in a little more detail. The assessment is conducted and produces findings or gaps between our current state and ITIL good practices. These should be observations, ratings, or any other items that come out of the assessment activities. Next, each finding should be translated into an action item. In other words, for each gap found, what should be done to overcome the gap? Once we have our inventory of action items, the action items will then be prioritized and grouped into one or more initial win projects. We will then prioritize those initial win projects and prepare a separate document or write-up for each initial win to describe it. Conducting the assessment effort can happen in many different ways. These are some styles of how you may do this that are listed here. Interviews, one-on-one with individuals to gain information. Focus sessions, which might be interviewing or information gathering types of workshops with groups of people. Observations, observing people executing processes. Collecting data, artifacts that exist within your organization today that help support some of the findings or maybe help lead to further information and analysis. issuing surveys, collecting information through questions submitted to company staff and management. Again, there were 5 surveys that we discussed in Learning Module number 2 that came with your materials. And then assessment tools that may be little aids that you use to aggregate, compile, and rate responses to some of these findings. The OGC EIDL assessment tool is a little bit of EIDL version 2 focused, but certainly is a very simple way of gathering a tool that just simply lists questions, answer yes or no, and then it helps you calculate a maturity level for each of your processes. That is on a spreadsheet type of platform and is an example of an assessment tool that you might bring in to help do the assessment. If you hire a third-party consultant, they may actually have their own tools that they bring in to do something similar to that. As you go through this effort, you will also need a person to act in a coordinator role to handle just basic scheduling of interview sessions, maybe helping to collect data, distribution and collection of surveys. Pretty much an administrative task, but it's an effort that you need to have as you go through this effort. This is one example of how you might organize this particular work stage to execute on the assessment effort. Note that it's a very basic project structure. I have a manager, I have maybe some subject matter experts, and maybe some other people, stakeholders within the company off to the side. But notice that we have, again, 4 key tracks of effort: organization, process, technology, and governance. Again, those are the 4 pillars that we talked about earlier of your solution. And as you will see in almost every learning module going forward, you will always see those 4 areas in some form or fashion for each of the efforts that's going on. If you are in a very large company where the assessment will be fairly complicated and inclusive, again, you may consider organizing like this to handle that. Have one track of the effort focus around the organization assessment, another round of process assessments, another round technology assessments, and another one around governance track assessments. And then each of these track leaders will then work together to coordinate those assessments and the findings that come out of that. If you are in a very small company, where maybe a very small number of employees in the IT organization, I would still consider these 4 tracks, but rather than have separate track leaders and project people in each area, you may have only 1 or 2 people that actually cover all 4 of those. So that's another way to kind of use this as you go forward. Again, even in a small company, I still need to look at organization, process, technology, and governance. In Learning Module number 2, we talked a little bit about that core team, extended team, advisor team, and subject matter expert in terms of participation roles for your project. During the assessment effort, the core team is the one that will be carrying out the bulk of the work in terms of doing the assessments and pulling the information together. The extended team, the advisor team, and the subject matter experts will participate by either answering the surveys, participating in workshops to provide information, but their role is basically to provide information to the core team as part of the assessment. The only other actions that they will take is once there are findings that come out of the assessment, those people, especially the extended team and the advisor team, will look at those outputs, those recommended initial wins, and help determine and prioritize what's most important. This is just an example of typical data artifacts to help aid the assessment. These items can help doing the assessment to better understand how the IT organization is currently managing their services, what policies are in place, and what key issues may exist that the organization is aware of. Again, this is a general list. The ones on this list are pretty typical of what you may ask for in an assessment. Organization charts, process documentation, capacity and performance reports, any kind of other service reports, continuity plans, policy documentation. Again, you can pick and choose from these items on a list like this and decide what's relevant to the assessment effort you're doing. One key thing is that when collecting these items, your IT staff should not have to scramble around and create these kinds of things. Either these artifacts exist or they don't. In addition, these kinds of artifacts should come from legitimate and trusted sources. So again, if you ask for these things and IT seems to be taking a long time because they're trying to pull things and move things together, that probably is a sign that they really don't exist to begin with, or if they do exist, nobody's really paying attention to them. So again, these are either in place or they're not in place. And again, this list just kind of gives you a guideline in terms of what you may be interested in looking at as you perform that assessment. Module 3, Lesson 2, Assessing Processes. Here we'll delve just a little bit deeper into what's involved with an IT service management assessment from a process perspective. Now let's see what to look for in a process assessment. These are typical areas that any assessor will start to look at. What's your process maturity rating, typically using a CMMI type scale from 0 to 5? Are there missing processes? Are there redundant processes? For example, maybe you have an incident management process, but you have a separate one for one IT department and another one for other IT departments. You may have a comparison to ITIL best practices or good practices now in version 3. You also may have a comparison to ISO 20000 controls. ISO 20000 is the only real standard, if you will, for IT service management that exists today in the industry. Some assessors will bring in the actual controls for ISO 20000 and also do a rough assessment against that for you as well. And then you may lastly have processes that are in place, but maybe they're a little bit inefficient. The output of the assessment will provide a process rating based on the Capability Maturity Model Integration, or CMMI standard, developed by the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. This is pretty typical of many ITIL process assessments. This rating will provide a general picture of how well processes are operating. The assessment should be looking for what rating your IT management practices are at today and how that rating compares to companies of a similar size or industry. It is recommended that you assess all ITIL V3 processes as part of the effort. And the reason for that is where IT thinks the problems may lie may actually be in other processes that than what they think are there. I've been in many companies where IT will scope down the assessment effort and say we really only want to look at these 4 or 5 processes, when in reality some of their burning issues and problems may be actually lying in other processes that they didn't think about. So by doing all ITIL processes, you get a very good look in terms of how IT is really operating. In addition, as shown here, the assessor should be looking for redundant processes, whether similar processes are operating independently in a number of organizations with variation. In other words, they're doing those processes differently across the board. And again, another example of this would be a change management process, possibly used by a server support group, and maybe there's a different change management process used by the network operations group. These are the kinds of things that the assessor looks for. There also should be a review to identify processes that are highly inefficient. This might include processes that operate at unacceptable speeds, use too many people, maybe they simply utilize too much labor, or else maybe they're just providing little or no value. Good example of something like that might be, let's say, an incident management process, and it requires 4 pages of user and incident description data to be filled out by hand before any further actions are taken to resolve the incident. That might be an example of a very painful process that people are working with just to work with their incidents. One key thing to note is that the maturity ratings are extremely subjective to the assessor or the third party that you end up using for your assessment. There is no science behind what makes you, let's say, a CMM level, let's say 2.1 for change management. How they derived a 2.1 is very much subjective and through the opinion of the assessor that's there. For that reason, that's why when you do get a maturity level, I usually treat that as an interesting benchmark. But in reality, that is not the goal of our implementation effort. I've been in a situation where people will say, our goal of our idle implementation effort is to go from CMMI, let's say 1.0 to maybe 2.5 for change management. That is really not a goal, and it's not something people can look at and say, as a result of that, they've solved any number of specific business problems. Again, you want to tie your implementation efforts to what actually solves real business problems. So don't overdo the maturity rating benchmark. It's an interesting benchmark, and it helps you understand what's going on, but it is really nothing more than that. Here are some examples of typical process assessment findings that an assessor may come out with. Again, may find processes that are missing, slow and inefficient processes, high amounts of manual labor, processes that are documented but not used or understood by your IT organization, maybe processes that exist but they're immature, duplicate processes with variation that exist in many places, processes that are standalone and not well integrated, and processes that provide little value. Again, you want to focus on the outcomes of the issues found more than what may be missing. In general, you want to be looking for inefficiencies, redundancies, and missing processes that contribute to specific business problems such as higher costs, service outages, or other risks that IT is trying to address. And again, these should link back to that vision that you did in the ITSM visioning stage. This is an example of a typical process maturity scale using CMMI for process assessments. The CMMI rating provides a general value, typically from 0, meaning your department's unaware of this process or maybe it doesn't exist at all, to 5, where you're highly optimized. This rating is usually expressed to the nearest 10th value observed, so it's not unusual for assessors to say you're a 2.7 in a particular process or a 1.3 in a particular process, just as an example. Again, those ratings are very subjective to the assessor's opinion. There's no real science behind that. The assessment effort will examine each idle process based on general criteria as shown above in each of the boxes. Independent assessors will typically add to this with specific validation criteria or other observations to confirm their overall rating. A separate rating will be done for each idle process, followed by an overall rating which averages out all the processes. It's not uncommon to see many fluctuation among the processes assessed. For example, you may have a very high rating for your incident management process, but maybe a very low rating for how you do service level management. The goal of this, ultimately, again, is not to have a high maturity level, but to solve a real business problem. It is also not really necessary from a business perspective to try to be a 5 in every single idle process. Again, tie this back to the vision and impact and some of the issues that the business is faced with. Where do you really need to be strong? Where does it not really mean so much? As an example, you may have a very mediocre change management process. Let's say you're maybe just a 1.0 or even maybe even a 0.5 on change management. Many companies would say that that's not really a good, strong change management practice that you're operating with. However, if the business situation in your company was such where you're very stable, things rarely change, and not a whole lot is going on, that may be perfectly acceptable at that level. So again, you want to tie back these ratings to what's really going on in your business and also what is the vision that you developed earlier. Slide 21. Here's an example of a process maturity report, not atypical of what many assessors may produce. Once a maturity rating has been determined, it usually gets compared to an average observed across other companies similar in size and industry. I've seen these done on line charts, graph charts. This example shows what we call a spider web chart. And here you see a number of the idle processes around the spider web. And in the yellow, that's basically the average of what maybe your company is experiencing, and the purple kind of shows maybe what the industry average is in your industry for each one of these processes. This just quickly shows you where you may stack up to others in your peer group or within your industry. A lot of times I've seen senior executives get very excited over this, especially if they know they've got lots of IT issues, and they suddenly see a finding like this that shows that, gee, the industry is well above where maybe you're operating today. And again, this is a benchmark which indicates that there are issues to be addressed. But again, the maturity level, or trying to get to a maturity level, should happen naturally, but not necessarily be a goal that you're shooting for. Slide 22. Module 3, Lesson 3, Assessing Technologies. In this lesson, we'll take a dive deeper into how you can assess your technology capabilities and how well they're providing value to your organization. In general, the assessment approach and issues approach is the same as we described for processes. We need to tie these issues back to the vision and impact. But in this learning module, in Lesson 3 specifically, we'll show you how you can analyze your tools to look for whether they're truly providing value and how well they may fit into your IT service management solutions. One key point to make here is that this assessment approach that we're going to present here does not make judgments of the quality of the tools that you may own. For example, if you own an incident management tool, we are not rating how well that tool is working on itself. We're making a judgment, though, on how well the tools are providing value to your organization. Therefore, it's possible that you may have purchased or bought the best architected tool in the world for incident management, but if you implemented it poorly, or people are having trouble using it, it'll still show up with a low rating on our assessment approach. So within this Lesson 3, we'll go through some of the ways that you can look at your tools in a very generic fashion and help assess where that value sits. Now let's see what a typical technology assessment typically looks for. Are you getting value from the tools? Functionality, integration, automation, usability, reporting capability, data quality, communications capability, openness, and supportability. These all represent the general ways that we're going to look at each tool that you have and that you own within your arsenal for IT service management. We will show you in later slides in this learning module how you can assess each one of those, so hang on a bit. This is not an exhaustive, detailed review of the functions and features of all your management tools. The criteria used here is very generic and not specific to any one tool or vendor. It's a little bit different way of looking at your tools, something that IT typically doesn't look at in this kind of a fashion, but we'll provide this additional detail in the upcoming slides. At a very minimum, each tool should be inventoried and mapped against the idle processes that it supports, and it may support more than one process. It's perfectly okay. It should then be examined within the generic categories shown above. And the output of this will actually generate a CMMI type rating for each of the tools that you own. For this assessment, we're looking for tools that perform duplicate function, tools that are maybe purchased but not used, tools that are hard to use. The key question being answered by this tooling assessment is whether the tools in place currently hurt or support the processes that they're associated with. Here are some examples of findings that may come up during your tool assessment efforts. For example, key tools and technologies needed to support IT service management or the plan vision are just not there. They're missing. Perhaps you don't have a change management tool even though you're doing change management. Another area might be the tools are in place, they exist, but they've not been implemented to their best advantages, or management just feels that little value has been gained. In other words, we brought, for example, a configuration management database tool. We don't feel we're getting any value out of that. Maybe looking for point tools. You have lots of tools in-house, but they're not well integrated. You may have tools that create more problems than they solve. You may have redundant tools that do the same thing. For example, you may have more than one incident management tool, for example. Personally, I've done this with one company, and we went in and did this kind of an assessment and found that they had 13 password crackers with their idle security management process. Something that people start to question why there's so many tools doing the same thing. Key tools and technologies that have no vendor support. This is a very key issue. If you're operating with tools that the vendor's not supporting, or they're custom built, or they're out of warranty, you are basically operating with some risk in your environment that you may want to mitigate. And you may flat out have shelfware. That's tools that have been purchased but just not used. Again, note that our focus is on how well the technology is supporting or capable of supporting your IT service management solutions and processes. It is not an examination of functions and features with a rendered opinion judgment. We're not judging vendor products, whether this vendor's product is good or bad, but only whether the products that you have purchased are really helping your organization. Here's a great example of something called a technology heat map. It's called this because anything in red indicates technology deficiencies and waste that's probably contributing to costs or poor capabilities. As an example, the reds may be probably tools that provide little or no value to your organization. I had one customer where we ran through this analysis and discovered that literally 98% of their service management tools were showing up red. In other words, if we eliminated the tooling licenses for those tools, we were able to fund a very large idle implementation effort just on the savings from that alone. The white spaces will typically indicate that no technology exists in those areas. That could be a good thing or not a good thing. Not a good thing if you have a whole function where there's no tools at all. This kind of a device and this approach is useful for just quickly highlighting how and where your technology is being used, how it may support or not support your idle processes, where you may have duplicate technologies, where they're being employed, and how all these fit within the IT infrastructure. In your downloads that came with the Implementing ITIL course, you have something called the IT Service Management Architecture Analysis Tool. That provides this kind of a spreadsheet, and I'll explain how that works a little bit farther down in this lesson. But the way this was done is it gives you those tooling functions, and you can simply pop your inventory of tools into that, map them against each of those functions, and then using those CMMI ratings, which we'll talk about in just a bit here, show whether there's any value with those tools in a landscape fashion similar to what this diagram is showing here. Now let's take a look at our CMMI-like approach for assessing the tools. Remember, we're going to be looking in about 9 different areas, and we'll take a look at each one of these areas and how we kind of applied the CMMI, again, subjective ratings to these. So while there's no real standard for doing this, we're kind of using this approach to help you rate your tools. You can look at each tool and quickly examine it and then render a CMMI type score in each area, average those out across the board if you want, and see where those tools kind of fall. This above chart lists general criteria for the functionality of the tool. So here we're first going to look at the functionality. How well does this tool particularly support IT service management or ITIL processes? It is in here where we're just addressing general function fit. And if you think of your ITIL V3 foundation exam, fit for purpose. How much fit for purpose is this particular tool with your ITIL processes? When you look at this, you can easily see, well, if the tool doesn't support any of the ITIL processes, then it hits a 0, that's missing. Whereas if it's very well supporting all the processes, and note the word all the platforms, that can actually give a very high score. One of the differences that gives you a higher score when looking at functionality is not only does it support the ITIL processes, but it supports the ITIL processes across all the platforms that you're operating with. Here's the next area that we can apply a CMMI rating to, technology integration. And what we're looking for here is how well does this tool share information with other technologies. In the integration category, we're assessing the degree to which the tool shares data, information, possibly workflow with other tools that you may be using to support your operations. As an example, if you have a tool and it maintains its own proprietary database and reports that such as these items can only be used with this tool, chances are that tool will get a low rating. So in other words, the only way I can get a report or get information is to use that particular tool in its proprietary database. And if I want to use that information elsewhere, then I have to somehow copy it or take some other steps to actually do that integration. So that's just one example of where a tool may not integrate well with everything else in your environment. So here again, we've got criteria that kind of shows just the levels of how it may share information with other technologies, and then we'll associate that with the appropriate CMMI type rating. Here's how we can assess automation, technology automation. And the key question we're looking at here is how well does this tool operate to reduce labor levels? So for the automation rating, we're looking at how much associated labor is required when we're using the tool. For example, a change management tool that automatically populates fields with problem data, auto-generates request forms, and provides an automated change management workflow would probably get a very high rating. A change management tool that forces you to repeat information across multiple forms or screens, maybe you have to manually code the working status into it, that may get a much lower rating. So again, it's basically how much labor does it take to actually input data and use the tool that's there. One other area to look at from a labor standpoint is support requirements. So are there other actions and steps you need to take around the tool in terms of backing up files, databases, or doing other maintenance tasks that make this tool either a high rating or a low rating? One example I could think of that might be a little unique for that might be I have a tool in place, and for whatever reason the vendor keeps supplying me with patches to that tool on a, let's say, a weekly or even a semi-daily basis. And so every other day it seems like we're having to put patches on top of the tool. That ends up taking a lot of work and effort on someone's part, and that would be an indication of probably a lower score when you're looking at the labor levels. Usability. Looking at your technology usability for this tool. How easy is this tool to use? The usability category is used to rate how easy the tool is to use, and as an example, a tool that is confusing, hard to use, or requires much staff training in order to understand it or operate it might get a low rating. A well-documented tool that's very intuitive to use, as an opposite example, would probably end up with a much higher rating. The reporting capability category identifies how easily report information can be tailored and customized. A tool that produces its own proprietary reports without any ability to customize or add information to them would get a low rating. So usually if the tool comes with a set of canned reports and there's absolutely nothing else you can execute except those canned reports, that will tend to be lower on the score rating. A tool that maybe, let's say, operates with putting reports into maybe an SQL type database where you can query against it or have the capabilities to do lots of ad hoc reports, that will end up with a much higher score. The data quality category rates how well data within the tool is handled. A lower rating would be given as an example. Maybe you have a capacity management tool and it stores the capacity modeling results statically only after each model is run. So the only way you can get that information is you have to load the tool, you have to input the model, and then you have to execute it, and then you see those results to actually get that data. A higher rating might be given, let's say, to a similar type of tool, but maybe this stores the capacity modeling results dynamically such that models can be combined or grouped into different scenarios, and the data is already there. You don't have to keep regenerating it in order to get to that. So again, the key question we're answering with this approach on the data quality side is, does it produce data that's easy to find, data that's easy to use, and data that's easy to manipulate? The communications capability category identifies how well a given tool channels its output. So let's say I have an event management or monitoring tool, but it only displays alerts on a systems console, nowhere else. That might end up with a very low rating. I may have a similar tool, an event monitoring tool, but it now allows results to be sent to a variety of channels, maybe pagers, cell phones, paging devices. Maybe it auto-generates a ticket to the service desk. Those kinds of things would end up getting a much higher rating. So essentially what we're saying there is, does this tool proactively communicate within your IT service management environment? Does it automatically provide things to other tools versus you having to keep going to the tool and manually extract that information or see what's going on? Assessing our technology openness or adaptability. This category identifies how open the tool is in terms of its architecture and ability to run across a variety of industry platforms. So let's say, for example, you have an incident management tool, but it will only run on a Wintel PC, let's say running Windows XP. Doesn't run on any other platform, doesn't run on any other operating system. This would tend to get a much lower rating than, let's say, another incident management tool that maybe runs on a general Unix platform and can be used with any platform that has a Unix operating system on it. So again, with this particular category of assessment for tools, we're looking to see how open the tool is and making sure that it's not tied to any specific platform or operating system. The supportability category identifies how well the tool is generally supported by its vendor. Let's say you have a release management tool, but the vendor's already declared an end-of-life warning on it, and there really is no real good support for that anymore. Maybe support is going away. Again, that supportability rating in that situation would probably be low. A similar tool, another release management tool that's well supported and strategic for its vendor, will probably get a high rating. So what you're really looking for here is, how well is this tool supported? Is this tool really strategic to the vendor that produced the tool? If it is, then you know that the support will be there. Another thing to consider outside of this, but still in the support area, is what is the general industry availability, the skills needed to support that tool. So if this is a tool that requires a skill set that's fairly rare in the industry, or maybe you need high-priced consultants to modify the tool or implement customizations, again, that would end up getting a low score. If the tool uses skill sets and common platforms that are very commonly available and fairly easy to support, then again, the rating for this would end up being much higher. So we've covered the different ratings from a CMMI type approach for how we might look at each of our individual tools. To help put that landscape together, as we said earlier, you have the IT Service Management Architecture Analysis tool, which is included with your student downloads. When you use that tool, the very first page of the tool will open up and you will see instructions step by step how you can input your tooling sets into that analysis tool and generate your own landscape for your own IT service management environment. In general, these are the steps that are shown in that tool. The first step you will do is just simply inventory all your tools. There's a place where you can list those tools in the spreadsheet inside that analysis tool, and you just simply list what you have there. We also look in step 2 at platform. What platforms do those tools cover? You may have redundant sets of tools, but there may be a good reason. For example, you may have an event management or event monitoring tool, but maybe it only looks at a subset of your infrastructure. Let's say it only monitors storage devices. So now you need another tool to maybe look at servers and maybe another tool to look at the network. So those are probably reasonably good reasons why you'd have redundant tool sets. So for that's why we need to look at all the platforms, and step 2 will help you populate your analysis tool with those platforms. Step 3 is the value analysis sheet. This is where you're going to put your CMMI scores, similar to the previous slides that we just discussed, and averaging them out to come up with a CMMI rating for each tool that's there. In the functional analysis sheet, we're going to map your tool to what idle processes it typically supports. So at the end of this, when we get to step 5, without really doing anything, the tool will generate a functional heat map, and again, that will give you the landscape showing where you may have redundancies or missing tools or tools in the red, and that will show up on that step 5 on one of the spreadsheets. And then in step 6, a platform heat map, which just kind of gives you a high-level view as to how well you're covered in terms of all your platforms with your tooling set. So this, again, the detailed instructions you'll kind of see when you open up the tool on that first page, but try to present this in a step-by-step fashion that you can do without taking too much effort to kind of analyze your own tools and your own landscape to pull this assessment, technology assessment together. One last item that can't be missed is the use of custom tools. These should be a warning flag if they are found during the assessment. I know IT likes to build tools and may feel they support these very well, but custom tools represent a risk with your infrastructure. The positive side to having a custom tool is it may be needed to fill in a gap that vendors are not addressing, and certainly that's certainly a good use for these if you have to do that. But again, that gap needs to be very critical to what you do as a business. They're cheaper to do in the short term, but not the long term. I want to point that out. But in the short term, it may be a cheaper option. And a lot of times IT will feel it easily integrates with how they operate because they're designing and building it to their own specifications. So those are all good reasons and the good side of using custom tools. But let's take a look at the downside of this. This becomes very expensive in the mid to long term. And the reason for that is that as technologies change, as the business changes, your IT organization is on the hook to make sure that that tool will always work with the new platforms and the new technologies that are coming on board or new requirements that people are asking for. Again, if you weren't doing this, the vendor would have to be doing this and they would leverage that risk for you. In some cases, I've actually seen that problem bottleneck future strategic efforts by the business, where all of a sudden the custom tool becomes almost like a stranglehold on IT where they can't get a lot of things done because they're stuck with this tool and it's very expensive to get off it. Maybe require staff burden to support things as the technology changes, as we've said. You may miss out on new technology gains. Again, vendors will be doing research, they will be doing analysis in the industry, and they will be proactively improving their tools as time goes on. Again, you miss out on that and end up having to take that responsibility within your own organization. And then lastly, the build efforts to do this and build your own custom tools are really taking time away from other projects that may produce more value. So I'm not saying never do custom tools here, but would say if you see a lot of these in use or they're being used in very critical process areas, it should be a warning flag if you find these during the assessment. The return on investment for developing and using customized tools has historically been very low. Therefore, the use of these should be carefully looked at and make sure you're using them only for very unique needs or some competitive advantage that is really supporting your business in a unique way. Module 3, Lesson 4, Assessing the Organization. In this lesson, we'll take a deeper dive into some approaches for looking at the organization and the people resources that support your IT services today. Here's typically what we look for within an organization assessment. A general look should be taken at the skill levels of the IT staff. Are there gaps between their skill sets and the architectures, tools, or processes being deployed? For example, if you're trying to transition to an ITIL IT service management type of culture and good practices, has anybody in your organization even heard of ITIL? Do they have any skills in that area? Have service outages occurred related to skills of the staff? Culture. Are there areas where maybe the culture is not conducive to implementing IT service management? An example we used in Learning Module 2 of IT organizations may be that never go out to talk to their customers, as an example, might be a barrier that needs to be overcome or at least identified in the assessment. Roles and responsibilities. Are roles and responsibilities clearly understood within the IT organization, or is there confusion over who and what job does what kinds of things or who's responsible for what types of items or areas? Readiness for change. Is the organization ready to change, or will there be lots of resistance? And then reporting structures. Are the reporting structures in place in your IT management organization conducive to operating with an IT service management type of set of good practices? Here's some examples of organization assessment findings. This gives you kind of an idea of the kinds of things that you typically look for when assessing your organization. Inadequate skills in place. Again, for whatever reason, the level of skills within your organization, there are gaps between what they will need to use when they move to an ITIL type of approach, or maybe they just in general today don't have the skills to operate the platforms and services that they run today. Maybe poor communications between support groups. Nobody talks to anybody. Again, confusion over roles and responsibilities. Maybe you have the opposite of that, redundant roles and responsibilities. So too many people are responsible for different areas, and there's arguments over maybe who should own something versus not own it. Cultural barriers that get in the way of a successful IT service management effort. Your organization's not ready to change. Maybe you have an authoritarian culture that may end up limiting your IT service management success. Not enough or too much IT staff to support IT service management. Or maybe you just in general have an over-reliance on contractors or vendors for critical services. A couple of tools you can use to do this assessment are in the surveys that we went over in the learning module number 2 when we talked about the IT service management vision. So for example, the cultural assessment could be one example of a survey you can use to assess your company culture. Again, my favorite, the labor survey, very good for trying to just in general figure out, are people spending time doing value work, or are they spending time chasing after incidents and bad changes and other things that really represent non-value or unplanned labor. Roles and responsibilities can be checked for duplicate owners, missing owners, confusion or finger pointing over responsibilities. Again, readiness for change, company reporting structures can also be seen. Again, a very good reason for having a good independent assessor, especially for this organization area. Very key to having that independent view of how well your organization is really structured, and what the culture is, and how well it's the skills and people are really communicating and operating. One example of an organization that I know will have major challenges in their ITIL implementation effort, I kind of call this the CIO from hell story, is this was a mid-sized IT support organization, and the CIO of that organization was extremely authoritarian. And when we sat in the meetings, in the workshops, and could see on the faces of the people there that every time the CIO came in the room, everybody basically would stop talking. Nobody would want to render an opinion, a decision, or an idea. And the CIO would start to do all the talking for everyone else. This is a great cultural example of an organization that's going to have a very hard time with ITIL and IT service management. Because in that environment, the decision-making really needs to occur at all different levels. And if only the CIO is the only one controlling everything, it's going to be very hard to make a success of that. Here's an example of something called a RACI chart. RACI typically stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. This is a technique, it's been around for decades, but it's a good way to look at your organization by mapping your roles and responsibilities into a chart, which we'll show in just a little bit. Really to identify missing, inadequate, duplicate roles and responsibilities within the organization. Initially, as you look at this, the way to think of this, RACI, responsible, basically means those are the people that might be doing the work. A is typically accountable, so I have a role in the organization that's on the hook to make sure the work gets done. C means must be consulted prior to a decision, so probably maybe this is a role that gets asked for input before a decision is made. And I may be just others in the organization that just need to know what's going on. In other words, just simply informed. RACI. The things that we're looking for in the assessment when we use this with an organization is, number one, we want to look to see things like, are there too many R's? So in other words, that may indicate that the workload for this particular idle process area is just way too high. Too many A's. If we have too many A's, that means there's going to be confusion and around separation and things around ownership of different types of tasks and responsibilities and processes. Typically, the rule with RACI is you should have one A for each area. When you start to have more than one A, that's typically a sign that there's a lot of finger pointing and confusion going on. C, consulted, may be just simply helping us understand what areas are involved in providing input, and same with I in terms of who needs to be informed and know what's going on. So some of the rules are kind of illustrated if you look at the by activity on the things to consider. As we go through this exercise, you typically only want one and only one A per task. You typically want at least one R in there, so somebody's got to be doing the work. Too many C's may be a sign of a bottleneck. In other words, I have so many consultants that I need to go to make the decisions or provide input. It may take a long time to get this activity done. And too many I's may have the similar type of problem. There's too many people that have to know about things, and is that just really a good use of time as you go through that activity? So let's take a look at what one of these types of assessments might look like. Here's an example of a RACI chart in action. Each idle process activity is listed to the left. Your company organization positions or key roles are represented in each column. The RACI indicators are then entered into each cell. So here is a simple example. We have two idle processes shown here, incident management and problem management. And underneath each of these, row by row, we've identified the key activities within those processes. For your assessment, this is probably as deep as you need to go, so I would not recommend going deeper than the activity level for each idle process that you include with this. In the columns, as you'll notice, I have in this example a CIO, manager 1, manager 2, an analyst, and maybe an agent. Again, these are how you are organized, what the key roles are, or maybe you can even put the job titles in there, but they're listed in each column. And then within each cell, I've put an R, A, C, or I, depending on which of those jobs or roles, how that relates to the activity level for each process that's there. In the example that we have here, the first activity for incident management shows that two managers are responsible for providing incident information and no one is accountable. And we can see that because we have two R's and no A's that are listed for that producing incident management reports and information task. This might indicate a situation where incident management information is coming from multiple departments and there is no overall accountability. The CIO of this organization is probably getting different incident information from different sources, and probably there's no overall picture of how incidents are impacting the organization. So that's just an example of how you might use something like this. Again, this takes time to do, and you can see you start with the process approach to make this happen. But the RACI approach, RACI, is a very good way of just getting a thumbnail sketch of how your organization is operating from an organization level in terms of roles and responsibilities. Comparing the organization to best practices. There is no real best practice in terms of how you should organize to run and operate a large-scale IT data center. However, there are what I would say are good practices for doing that, and the most common one I'm kind of presenting here. If you grab your organization chart and take a look at that, there should be at least 3 major functions that you can look at in your organization that are somewhat separated and operating together. Those functions are kind of shown on here, where I have a services manager, a services planning manager, and an operations manager. And you probably think of these in terms of their general functions. At a minimum, this organization pipeline includes functions that handle service management. This is on the service manager side. They handle service management, communications out to the business, identifying new business service requirements, and reporting on services. That pipeline or stack on the services manager side represents all the people and functions that typically interface between IT and the business. So what they're going to do is generally hand off requirements to the rest of IT. The middle pipeline, the service planning manager, or that stack under that, addresses planning and building of new services or changes to services. That's the group that actually designs, builds, and transitions solutions to production. And then the rightmost pipeline, the operations manager, is executing day-to-day operations. Now, while you may look at your IT organization, and in a large company, those can get to be very complex in structure. Generally, when you look at these, you want to be able to discern, is there a general alignment as you look at that chart of having a services stack that interfaces between IT and the customer, having another stack that does all the design, build, and transition work, and then another stack that handles the day-to-day operations. If you're organized by at least, and you can discern those stacks within your own organization, chances are things are generally fairly good in terms of your success rate, especially as you move to an ITIL platform. Experience has shown that organizations that tend to mix these up, or they structure in a manner that differs something different from the above, they typically have many IT inefficiencies and lots of problems in finger pointing. As an example, I've seen, for let's say, IT operational groups that also have development and people that are building solutions embedded within the operations group. Now I've got people that are always conflicted and mixing things up between, should I be working on this because I have an incident to fix, or should I be working on this because I have a project to complete? Who's responsible? Who gets things done? Who's going to make things work and run? So in general, when you look at the organization structure, typically try to see if you can discern these kinds of things. Now let's talk about, we've spent some time talking about this kind of a comparison to best practices from an organization reporting aspect. We looked at the RACI as another example. We talked about looking at IT skills. There wasn't really a CMMI type of approach for organization. But what you're going to do is use these kinds of assessment approaches to drive out your inventory of issues and action plans. So again, these are just tools that you can use to identify where some issues and problems exist, and then add them to your assessment inventory. Module 3, Lesson 5, Assessing Governance and Reporting Practices. In this lesson, we'll dive a little bit deeper into how you can assess your organization in terms of controls, decision-making, and how they're communicating results or service reporting. Here is what to look for in the governance assessment. A general check should be done at the kind of reporting that may exist around services, whether service quality is attended to, and whether an ongoing improvement program is in place. Again, using ITIL version 3 concepts, there should be measurements and reports against your services, against your processes, and against your technologies. My guess is that in most IT organizations, you'll find lots of reporting around technologies, probably almost no reporting around processes, and maybe some reporting which may not be useful around services. That's the typical situation for most IT organizations. But here, as you look at governance, you're trying to figure out how well is that reporting done. Does it cover, again, services, processes, and technologies? Do policies exist? Don't be surprised if much of this is missing. One of the goals of your ITIL implementation effort should be to begin instituting service governance as part of your solution. So if you see lots of these areas missing, certainly add this to your action item list, and note that some of your solutions that you'll be implementing will help close some of these gaps. Again, as you look at things that are missing or not in place, focus on the impact. For example, a monthly report that's not being used is just as bad as not having a monthly report at all. Don't get sidetracked by voluminous reports with lots of charts and graphs. If the business is not using them, then that's just as bad as not having any reports at all. Interesting example I had was with a very large international bank where they had a whole team of people producing service and technology types of reports. hundreds of pages every month, and these were just loaded with numbers and statistics, charts and graphs. And when the company went through a downturn and the bank needed to cut costs, guess which group ended up going out the door first? It was this reporting group. That gives you a very good sign in terms of how the business felt, in terms of the value that they were providing. So again, look for impact. If a lot of things are missing, that doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing, or you need to prioritize fixing that, unless it's causing a business issue or problem that people want to fix. Here's some examples of what governance assessments may uncover. Key areas to look for are levels of service reporting and alignment of the IT activities with business goals and objectives. So examples of things we will be looking at are missing reports that describe the quality of IT processes. In other words, there's no reporting on processes at all. There may be no reporting on service levels or service quality. Nobody's reporting on services. You may have lots of reports, but much effort's being spent on reporting metrics that are seldom looked at. There's no ongoing service improvement program or reactive culture, so maybe people are producing reports, but there's no real program to look at the outputs of those reports and then use that as input to continually improve the services and the way that IT is operating. There may be just a general lack of service levels and other operational targets. Maybe there's a lack of governance processes and controls. There may be a past history with IT audit failures or industry non-compliance. Maybe your company's actually paying fines because they can't meet PCI or SOX requirements, just as an example. Again, that could be part of your return on investment as you start to pull your ITIL program together. And in general, maybe your key activities and priorities are just misaligned with business goals. So the business is off trying to get other things done, and IT is instituting projects and programs in areas that the business really says don't provide a lot of value or take away funds from other things the business would like to get done. So here's a CMMI-like approach for assessing governance. IT practices that produce little or no measurements will probably rate low on this chart. Those that consistently measure their service operational quality will probably rate higher. So if we look at, there are really no measurements being taken, IT's not reporting on service quality, maybe IT even determines what services should be provided on behalf of the business, that's probably good for a 0 on this scale here. As you move up the scale, maybe there are some measuring and reporting, maybe there are instances where IT does meet with the business on some periodic basis. Maybe there's some decision-making authority that's established and in place to help make decisions that's aligned with the business. So that might end up getting a middle or higher rating. And as you get more towards the mature and world-class, you may actually see signs that there's a business strategy that's been articulated, and there's been efforts to tie the IT strategy into that business strategy and then report on the IT strategy from an IT perspective over time. And continually, proactively implement continual service improvement in line with that strategy. That might get you up to the 4 or 5 level. So again, this is a very subjective way to do this, but may help yield just kind of a general where you're at and currently with your governance practices. Let's now take a checkpoint as to where we are in the ITIL implementation lifecycle. We've developed a program vision. We've now assessed the current state operational environment for gaps, looking at our processes, technologies, organization, and governance. We still need to identify, however, and prioritize our action items, our strategic efforts, translate those to initial wins, pull our program teams together, and develop some detailed work plans for moving forward. Those last steps will be covered in Module 4 as we get into the IT service management planning stage. Learning Module number 4 will cover how we translate our assessment results into those action plans, strategies, and going forward activities. We'll cover implementation program planning and getting started on our initial wins. We'll also include a step that shows how to get started with building an IT service management architecture. This architecture will become the blueprint for our processes, technologies, and organization and governance solutions that we will be building.